some of which people in this room have participated in. We're going to try to give you a little update on some of the research. It may be weird, annoying, or hard to understand, but we'll try to walk through it. And then it should leave us plenty of time for any specific questions people have. And then now everyone's together and can be forced to find a way to go places maybe together afterwards. Next year we need some official social coordinator. I don't know who coordinated last year. I don't know.
Kristen.
Was that what it was? I thought maybe it was, and she wasn't going to come this year.
Melissa and Jamie. And Jamie.
And me and Melissa.
Yeah. Because you guys had it all down last year. That was impressive. Well, we'll figure it out. Okay. Well, I'm Dr. Shoemaker. For anyone who hasn't met me yet, and we'll see if I can make my happy PowerPoint out. There we go. All right. So we're mostly going to talk today about pseudohypopathyroidism, which is what we all think you have some version of. It's a crazy, complicated disease, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about at the beginning is just how complicated this is and why you probably are confused, and it's not just you, it's a lot of your doctors too. So these are all things that may or may not happen depending on what kind of PHP you have. Some patients have trouble with early weight gain, some patients will have learning problems or cognitive impairment, some patients will have hormone problems, some people will get what are called subcutaneous ossifications. People will call them calcifications or little bumps. And then some people have what's called that Albright hereditary osteodystrophy phenotype. And phenotype really just means kind of how you look. So you'll notice a lot of the kids look like long-lost cousins. That's because they have the AHO phenotype. And you can have all combinations of this, and it can even look different in the same family. So the phenotype, that AHO phenotype, a lot of what you'll see is the round face, but then also the kids tend to have gained weight at a really young age. So this is a growth chart. It's showing you a girl and how their weight changed over time. So this is years at the bottom, starting at 2 and going to 20, and then this is weight. And what you'll see is by the time the child's 2, they're much heavier than you would expect. And after that, a lot of patients will sort of follow the curve, sort of growing along their own curve, so staying above the chart but not necessarily going crazy up higher. And that's a little different than some of the other genetic disorders I follow where early weight gain is a problem. So other things like you may have heard of leptin deficiency or MC4 receptor mutation, some of those patients will just go up at this crazy line, so they're off this chart by the time the kids are 8 or 9. So this is a little different. The other thing that'll happen is they have those differences in their growth plates. So you've probably heard a lot about people with AHO being shorter. And they're oftentimes not shorter when they're younger. So if you look, this is a height growth chart, and it's showing you a child who's actually grown quite nicely as a young child. They're actually on the upper end, they're pretty tall. But when we look at the growth plates, we look at an x-ray of the hand and a bone age, you can see that their bones look like someone who's much older, like a teenager. And what that means is that the child's going to stop growing sooner than you expected. So they tend to sort of grow and then just stop. And they end up shorter than average for most patients. They also tend not to get a really great pubertal growth spurt, which is another reason that they don't end up as tall as we would hope. That early closure of the growth plate is also why you get that brachydactyly, or those short fingers, or the lack of knuckles when people do the fish to get the little dimples. And that's something that happens over time, so you're not usually born with those fingers. It's just as you're growing, we don't really understand exactly why, these bones, for some reason, stop growing really quickly. So a lot of times by the kids are 5 or 6 years old, you can start seeing that that's shorter. And the same thing's true of the toe. And that is those features, the shorter statue, the round face, the weight gain, the changes in the hands and feet, that's what people usually mean when they talk about AHO or the albrights phenotype. This is to show you it's really darn complicated. So this is the gene. It's located on chromosome 20. The gene is called GNAS, or GNAS, and it is one of the most complex regions in all of the genome. So this is a gene that you can read this way or this way, so you can make different products depending on which way you read it. You sometimes you can take different pieces of it and combine them, so you can go from this to this. to that and make one product, or you can go from this to this to this. So you can make all kinds of different things depending on how you fit the little puzzle pieces together. And some of the genes prefer to be expressed from the maternal or the mom's chromosome. Others prefer to be expressed from the paternal or the dad's chromosome. And it's a big mess. So it's a really, really complex region, and this is why it makes so many different diseases and can be really hard for everyone to understand. So it's not just you, it's crazy. So the different types of PHP, we came up with these names 100 years ago.
You're so
almost.
moved.
Touch my thing. There we go. Okay. So we came up with these names a really long time ago before anyone knew about genetics. And actually before we even really were good at testing the hormones. Hence the really lovely names of pseudo or pseudo hypoparathyroidism. What we have learned, particularly over these past 4 or 5 years, is that the underlying genetic problem actually really, there's a lot of overlap between what we thought were kind of distinct baskets of syndrome. So there's a lot of debate as to what this will all get called in the future to try to do a better job of having everybody understanding what's going on. But right now, we tend to call things either PHP type 1B, type 1A, or PPHP, or pseudo-hypoparathyroidism. But it turns out that those patients can look like each other. So classically, we thought of this type 1B as patients who just had resistance to parathyroid hormone, and that was it. So they grew normally, they developed normally, they didn't have problems with weight gain, they didn't have problems with any other hormones, they just developed the low calciums and resistance to the parathyroid hormones. And that was called type 1B. We've now learned that people with, and that's due, if you go back, for anyone who likes genetics, that's due not to a problem in the actual gene exons, that's due to a problem with the control regions, so the methylation regions. And we thought that that was just very straightforward, that if you had a problem with the methylation, you got 1B, and if you had a problem in the gene, you got 1A, or PPHP. Turns out we were wrong. So we get both. So people with 1B can have just the parathyroid hormone resistance. But some of them, about 15% of them, will actually have, that's all patients, but a percentage of them, about half, will also have other hormones they're resistant to, most commonly thyroid hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone. And some patients with 1B actually look just like someone with 1A. And so we couldn't tell the difference until we started doing genetic testing. So there was a group of patients that we used to think we just couldn't find the gene mutation, and then when they went back and started to look at the methylation, figured out that, oh, we diagnosed you with 1A and it's actually 1B, you just look like 1A. Which you can see, who knows whether that matters or not. There's one chair up here, and you guys are welcome to pull chairs around if you want. There's 2 over here, and there's 1 here. And you can pull them to the back if you don't want to be all the way. The 1A, classically, you'll have the albrights phenotype as well as hormone resistance. And then PPHP is when it's the same mutation as 1A, but it's on the paternal allele. And those patients usually have either just the albrights, so maybe they're a little shorter than other people in their family, or have a little shortening of their fingers. They typically don't have any hormone problems. They can get the ossifications, and they can actually get really severe ossifications. There's a form called POH, or progressive ossifications, that happens sometimes in people on the paternal allele. So there's 3 kinds, but the genetics don't really match up. So we may or may not keep trying to change the name, but that's really hard. One of the big things we've worked on in these past couple of years, really led by parent questions and needs to do a better job of communicating with schools and figuring out what resources kids should use, is trying to understand the cognitive impairment that some patients will have. So one of the things that we've learned is it does seem to be pretty specific to the 1A, or the maternal inheritance pattern. So this was a paper where they looked at sort of all of the case reports that had been published over decades, and just did they say, not that the patients were tested for it, but did they report, okay, this person had some learning problems or some developmental delays. And they found the majority of patients with 1A, 78%, reported some sort of developmental delay issues, and they only found 11% of the PPHD or the paternal inheritance. Now, these were not studied, they weren't people that all came into the lab and did the exact same thing. It's just, in general, was that something that made it into the paper. But it lets us know that this is probably something that's more specific to 1A. So what we've done since, and this is not published yet, but it's submitted, so hopefully I'll be able to get it to you guys soon. One of the things we've done is now looked at 19 patients with PHP 1A and compared them with both their siblings as well as control patients that were similar in weight and age and race and kind of all of those things. And what you'll find, so this is looking at IQ. There's verbal, nonverbal, and composite. The little dotted lines show you what's considered the normal range or anything within one standard deviation of the mean. And what you see is on average, our patients with PHP are on the lower end. So they're significantly lower than their siblings and controls. That composite IQ is averaged at 85.9, which is right on the lower end of normal. There's a really big range. So as you can see, the spread is really wide, particularly in the nonverbal. So some of the patients had a much harder time than others, very big spreads. And one important thing I'll say, the way we did this testing, it was not time-based. And I think we got, I think all the patients did much better without time-based testing. A lot of the kids we found took a little bit longer to answer questions. They could get to the right answer, they just needed longer to think about it. So we probably would have seen lower scores if we'd done one of the time-based tests. This is comparing to siblings. So one of the biggest predictors of what your IQ will be is what your family is, and that should make sense to people, you know, depending on genetics and education and whatnot. And in general, what you see is everybody is a little bit lower than their siblings. So there's still a really big range for our patients with PHP, and there's a range for their siblings, but everybody was lower, on average about 22 points lower than their sibling. So that was helpful to get an idea of what was going on. The other things we looked at is sort of just how you learn and behavioral issues and what other challenges are patients facing. And in general, the patients with PHP did have what we call lower adaptive behavior, which is sort of how you are in the world. So social skills, activities of daily living, ability to organize, all of those things tended to be lower than their siblings. So the areas where there were the most problems, some problems with particularly anxiety and ADHD. The ADHD is not that hyperactive, necessarily impulsive type. It's more the inattentive. A lot of the patients had a hard time staying on task, staying focused, needing more frequent redirection. And it'll be really interesting to keep looking. I know a lot of kids have recently been put on ADHD meds, and some people have really found that helpful. We'll have to see if that's helpful in the future. The other thing we found is a little bit of trouble with organizing. So this thing called executive performance is your ability to manage tasks, to prioritize, to keep track of multiple things. You'll notice kids in particular have problems with executive function at particular grade levels. So oftentimes somewhere second, third grade, they start to ask you to keep track of more stuff. And then middle school, whenever they go to middle school and have to do the different classes, that's often a really big challenge. And it's that ability to keep track of all of these things and prioritize tasks and stay organized. The two areas of executive performance that patients most commonly struggled in was memory, so the ability to keep several things in their head and keep track of them at the same time, and then initiate, the ability to sort of get started on a task. So these things are all going to be explained in the paper we've submitted, and I hope will be helpful as a starting point, just a starting point, for families when you're going to meet with schools and working on IEPs and whatnot, to give them an idea of, here's some areas that we know my child may struggle with and we should probably pay extra attention to, and they may need extra resources, because the kids can learn they can really make progress, but they just might need a little more time and a little more just resources. So when we looked at what families had received, what children with this disorder are getting on average in school, the majority of kids, at least at some point in time, had some special education classrooms, whether it was getting pulled out for part of the day to have special, to be in a special group for reading or math, or being full-time in a school that was, more self-contained special education. Some patients only did that for a few years and then were able to move back into the more mainstream curriculum. Other patients have stayed in that long-term. A lot of patients repeated a grade, and that for us is just particularly a sign that we need to do a better job with early intervention. So if we make the diagnosis earlier, trying to get a lot of resources so that we can start intervening and the school can be prepared before they show up in kindergarten. Because a lot of times if you go into kindergarten and no one had realized there were problems, it sort of takes the whole year before they get resources in place, and then you have to start over. And we like kids to be going into school already knowing, okay, here are things that they may benefit from. We want them to have OT and speech and whatnot. And same thing, a lot of the kids are getting OT, PT, and speech. In truth, probably everybody could benefit from it. And it's just going to be a matter of us trying to help advocate for it. So the other big question, and really where I spend most of my time working on in general, is why is this weight gain a thing? So this is to go back a little bit to the basic science and everything. The reason that people with PHP get symptoms, the reason there are problems, has to do with these tiny little things called G proteins. And it's actually this little pink guy, which is the alpha subunit of the stimulatory G protein. So this whole little thing here is called a G protein, and that's the little alpha subunit. And what happens is all throughout your body, you have these receptors. So you have receptors for hormones, you have receptors for just in your neurons, you have receptors all over your body, and that's one of the ways your body tells each cell what to do. Some receptors work through these little G proteins, and those are called G protein coupled receptors. And a lot of your hormones are G protein coupled receptors and GPCRs. So what happens when you have a G protein coupled receptor is this little green guy is your receptor. And when the ligand binds to it, say it's your TSH receptor. So when your thyroid stimulating hormone binds to it on the thyroid, it's supposed to then tell that little thyroid cell, release thyroid hormone. And the way it does that is the little G protein comes over to the receptor, it says, ooh, you're active. And then this little alpha subunit comes over here and tells your cell to start making something called cyclic AMP. And then that starts the signaling cascade that results in a release of thyroid hormone. The problem with this disorder is not that there's any problem with your receptor. Your TSH receptor is fine, your body makes TSH, but when the TSH binds the receptor, the signal never goes through, and your cell doesn't know to release the thyroid hormone. So it's this little tiny pink guy that's causing all the problems. The reason we think people with this disorder oftentimes will have a trouble with weight gain, particularly if they've inherited a mutation on the maternal allele, is in your brain, you've got these really important neurons called MC4, or melanocortin-4 receptor neurons. So they're in your hypothalamus. It's a teeny little spot in your brain, kind of right above your pituitary, and it is, so one of my mentors would call it the adipostat. So instead of your thermostat that controls the temperature really tightly, it's your adipostat. It controls body weight really tightly. So it's the little piece of the brain that says, how much energy have I taken in? How much am I expending? How much fat stores do I have in reserve? And it titrates. And anyone who has ever gained weight and tried to lose it knows it tries really hard to hold you where you are. So it's the reason that when people lose weight, they drop their metabolism and their body really tries to put the weight back on. It's this little adipostat that defends your body weight. And in people with PHP, these neurons in the hypothalamus really like to use the maternal or mom gene. And that's the one that we have problems with in 1A. So what is supposed to happen is your little ligand binds to it, you get your little G protein that's working, you get that cyclic AMP I mentioned before, and the things that happen when you're stimulating these neurons are you increase sympathetic tone, that means you increase heart rate and blood pressure stay up, You increase energy expenditure, so metabolism. You're burning more calories. Your body feels willing to move and exercise and just burn calories. And it suppresses food intake, so it makes people not feel as hungry, not have a drive to eat. And with PHP, 1A in particular, you have problems with this little guy, and therefore you don't do all of those things normally. And that's exactly what we find when we look at energy expenditure in patients with 1A. So this is comparing, so if we know your height and weight and age and gender, we can make a pretty good guess about what your metabolism is, like how many calories your body burns. And if we compare, if we then go and measure it, so you come into our research center and we put the little bubble over your head that lots of kids here have done, and we measure how many calories you're burning. The prediction usually comes out, there's a range. But when you compare the predicted energy expenditure to what we measure, these are control patients are up here with their range, and then these are our PHP patients down here. So they burn less energy than you would expect, and it's more precise when you do it this way. So then the main driver of your metabolism is how much lean mass you have, how much muscle you have. So it's one of the reasons we'll say you want to exercise, in adults they'll say, don't forget strength training, weightlifting, because every pound of muscle you have will keep burning calories even when you're not exercising. So typically there's a pretty straight line between how much muscle mass you have, which is called fat-free mass here, and how many calories you burn each day. They're pretty closely related. And the little open triangles here are just generally healthy patients, kids that don't have any known medical problem. And the little black circles here are all kids that have PHP type 1A. And what you'll see is for however much muscle they have, they burn less than the average kid. So their little straight line is down here, and the other typically developing kids are up here. And really what it means on average, it's about, it's about 250, 300 calories less per day. That's a little bit of a simplification, but it gives you an idea that they can almost eat like one less meal per day than another kid. And it's just not something you're naturally going to do. So it's one of the only disorders we know of where patients are gaining weight primarily due to slow metabolism as opposed to just a really increased drive to eat. The hunger question is a little less clear. We're working, we have some more data from the research studies that we just did. We're going to try to get a better idea of what's going on with hunger in this disorder, but they're not always super hungry, and some of that seems to just depend on each patient and maybe depend on age, and we have a lot to learn about this. But this is looking at something called a hyperphagia questionnaire. I've given it to a lot of you guys before. It's those 12 questions asking about how hungry you are, how your child is, how easy it is to redirect them when they start thinking about food, how quickly they want to eat again, things like that. And what you'll see is patients without any trouble with their weight tend to have scores 20 or less. Patients that have trouble with their weight can have a real large range in scores. So these are our patients that aren't known to have any genetic problem, and you can see some of them aren't very hungry and some of them say that they're really, really hungry all the time. We see kind of the same thing with our patients with PHP. Some of them do report a lot of hunger and kind of food-seeking feelings, and other kids are like, yeah, I'm not really hungry, I just gain weight really easily. And then this is to show you kind of the range. So, like I said, patients that don't have trouble with weight are over here. These guys, they tend to be less than 20. Patients that have trouble with weight gain, but no known reason for it, no genetic cause, tend to be a little bit higher. And then these are our patients with PHP, they're here. So pretty similar to our control patients, but definitely higher than their siblings or people who haven't had trouble with weight. And then a disorder like Prader-Willi is over here, much higher, and they all pretty much consistently will have a really increased drive to eat. And then these are a couple other genetic disorders. So it's not that the patients with PHP aren't hungry, it's just not entirely clear how much that's contributing to the weight gain, or is it just they have relatively normal hunger and this darn slow metabolism, and then they're stuck. So this is something we're going to keep working on. The main reason being it helps us to try to figure out how to treat patients, and maybe there is a difference between some kids and others. It may not be the same for every patient. So the other question is, well, if they have trouble with weight gain, what about as you're getting older? What do we need to worry about for heart disease or blood pressure or cholesterol or diabetes and those kind of things? And really interestingly, so Dr. Weinstein at the NIH has published showing that adults with PHP had more trouble with being resistant to insulin, less sensitive, and insulin doesn't work as well, and more at risk for diabetes than you would expect based on their age and weight and whatnot. It was a really small study, and it included about half the patients. There were 8 adults with PHP. 4 of them had diabetes and 4 of them didn't. The hard part about studying grown-ups, no offense grown-ups, is the older you get, the more problems come up, just in general, for all of us as we get older. And your body gets just a little less clean, if that makes sense. So the great part about taking care of kids is they tend to have no other problems. So, they may have this disorder, but they don't tend to also have a bunch of other complications, and maybe they're going to get trouble with cholesterol as they get older, maybe they're going to have trouble with blood pressure, but they're less likely to have it already when they're 10 or 12 than they are when they're 30 or 40. So we wanted to see, was the same thing true of kids? Was this already a problem in our younger patients, who, like I said, are younger and less likely to be already having trouble with insulin or blood sugars? So what's fascinating to find is our kids with PHP actually have beautiful fasting blood sugars. So their average fasting blood sugar is in the 70s. It's significantly lower than patients who are similar in age and weight. So other kids who also had trouble with weight gain tend to have much higher fasting blood sugars, usually in the 80s, mid-80s to 90s. They actually have extremely normal fasting blood sugars. They also actually had really low levels of insulin resistance. So HOMA-IR is just a calculation we do to look at comparing blood sugars to insulin, and they were lower, so this is good. They were more sensitive or less resistant to insulin than other kids who just have general weight gain and obesity. But then, when we did these glucose tolerance tests and gave them a shot of sugar, and all the women in the room have done this before, you drink that gross orange drink, and then we check your blood for the next 2 hours, what we found is that they had a really hard time dealing with that sugar. So kids, typical patients, you can see the kids with just general weight gain had these higher fasting blood sugars. Our kids with PHP were lower here, and this is a really typical pattern. Their blood sugar shoots up in the first 30 minutes after drinking the sugar drink, and then it comes right back down. And by the time they get to 20 minutes, they're almost down, not 20 minutes, 2 hours, they're almost back down to where they started. Some people are all the way back down to where they started, some are getting close. But usually it's this really sharp peak and then comes back down. Our patients with PHP just had a much harder time dealing with the sugar. So you'll see some of them, they were still rising, an hour or more later. The highest blood sugars on average for our kids were actually at an hour, where typically the highest blood sugar is going to be at 15, 30 minutes. And then some of the patients were still rising at an hour and a half or even 2 hours. And then when you look at the 2-hour endpoint, you can see a lot of patients still have higher blood sugar. So on average, these blood sugars were much higher than the control patients, despite the fact that when they started, they had better blood sugars. So a couple of important things from that. One is the normal way that we as physicians will monitor someone for blood sugar problems, for diabetes, is either checking fasting blood sugars, which I just told you are going to be normal, or measuring something called a hemoglobin A1C. And a hemoglobin A1C looks at your little red blood cells, and the average red blood cell is going to live for 90 days. And basically it looks at how much sugar has gotten stuck on your red blood cell, and it presumes that it's been there for 90 days. And then you can have this range, so it's expressed as percent, and it works really well at looking at overall blood sugar, what is your body exposed to. It's what's used in diabetes for trying to predict complications, for saying how well someone's controlled. But it presumes that your red blood cells live for 90 days. In our patients with PHP1A, the A1Cs are also really low and normal, despite the fact that we know they're having higher blood sugars at times. And that's probably because red blood cells actually have the same problem with the GNAS gene. So there was a point in time where actually we did studies of the little red blood cells to try to determine what a patient had, how much expression there was of that gene. So I suspect that the red blood cells maybe aren't living the exact 90 days, and that may be the reason that the A1Cs look falsely low. The red blood cells are only there for 2 months, and we have 2 months to get sugar stuck on them, so they look better than if they've been around for 3 months. Not to worry about your red blood cells, they're working just fine, you're not anemic, it's just, it makes some of our tests not work as well. So to give you an idea, that we had 1 patient that actually had met criteria for type 2 diabetes, and 4 patients who are in the range of what was called impaired glucose tolerance. And to give you an idea of all the control patients we did, no one had any of these problems. And you can see their fasting blood sugars are really quite lovely. So someone with diabetes had a fasting blood sugar of 82. That's totally normal. It doesn't make me worried at all. And then their A1Cs, our patients with glucose tolerance, had very normal. Less than 5.7 is considered normal, and they were 5.2 to 5.4. And the patient with diabetes, it was 6.1. Typically, patients with A1Cs are going to be 6.5 or higher. So those were definitely better labs than we'd expect after we did more testing with the patients. So one of the things, and we're working to get this written up and published, but probably one of the things we'll need to recommend is that your doctors sort of follow blood sugars a little bit differently than they would typically. So rather than an A1C, they might want to check a different measurement, there's something called fructosamine. Rather than fasting blood sugars, it's probably better to say go have lunch and come to the office an hour or 2 later, and we'll take a look. But we definitely are interested in doing a better job with following diabetes. The other thing about this, and something that we're going to try to look at as we go forward with new studies, is because of this, we don't really understand exactly why this looks so different. The best guess is that it's a problem with the ability to secrete insulin. There's actually a whole bunch of hormones that happen that help insulin get secreted, and some of them are controlled by those G protein coupled receptors. So it's probably a problem with the ability to make insulin. So they can't make insulin quite as fast, which is why the blood sugars don't come down quite as fast. But that's something we still need to explore. The reason it's going to be really important to figure that out is it will change what medicines are best to treat blood sugar problems. Typically, the first medicine we use if someone has trouble with high blood sugars is something called metformin. And metformin is a great pill. It's pretty safe, gives people sometimes some stomach upset, but it tries to make your body more sensitive to insulin. And if that's not the problem here, it may not work very well for our patients. The more helpful, there's some other medicines that might be more helpful, and we'll need to think about it. So we're definitely going to be trying to figure out what's going on there in future studies. The other more recent thing that we've been looking at is the risk of sleep apnea. And a lot of you guys have heard me say this